Good morning and welcome to Whenever You Are. I am Bandit Haze, and today I'm going to be talking about Shigeru Miyamoto making some comments on games not being art, specifically his games not being art, talking about him seeing himself more as a designer than creating works of art. So I'm going to be talking about that. But before I get into that little nugget, just a little bit of a tradition we got going here. I just want to update you guys on some things going on with the channel, some things to come and all that good stuff. So mostly lately I've been playing, well still I should say mostly lately I've been playing GTA 5. So last week and the week before, that's pretty much what we're doing, GTA 5. Still enjoying the game. Still have plans to be talking about that game. However, that video is probably not going to be for a while because the plans that I have for that game, hopefully they come to fruition. But the plans that I have for the game, they're quite something. So it's going to take a little bit of planning. Plus, I still need to get through the game. I'm about 40% through the story, so I still got quite a bit to go. So hopefully I'll be completing that soon. And in fact, speaking of completing things soon, I would be having some time off work from next week for the Christmas and New Year's break. So the plan for me is to put out a little bit more videos than I usually do during that period. So make sure you subscribe, make sure you got your notifications turned on, make sure you don't miss a thing, because I don't want to miss a thing, and all that. I might even do a long ass GTA 5 live stream during that time as well to try and finish off the game, or at least get through as much of it as I can. So yeah, I say I might because yeah, so I'm thinking like start in the morning, start say, I don't know, 9 AM in the morning, and just do like a long ass gaming day up until, I don't know, 11 o'clock at night, 12, whatever, maybe go into the wee hours of the next day. That's what I'm thinking, but we'll see. A little bit of mental preparation for that sort of thing, methinks. But anyway, that's all to come, or all possibly to come, so yes, make sure you are all on board for that. But anyway, for now, let's talk about Shigeru Miyamoto. So Shigeru Miyamoto, for those who don't know, is the legendary games designer, the man behind Mario, Donkey Kong, The Legend of Zelda. He's done some stuff in his time that you might have heard of. And he was in an interview recently. He's promoting the game, the new Mario game for the iOS devices, Mario Run. And he was asked in an interview, and this interview, by the way, is from Glixel.com. I know about it from the know. I know about it from the know. So shout out to the know. Shout out to Glixel.com. And he was asked, so are you an artist or a designer? And he said, and I quote, "I'm a designer. I don't think of myself as creating works. I really think of myself as creating products for people to enjoy. That's why I've always called my games products rather than works of art. It's not about coming up with an idea coming up with an idea and trying to make that idea. The work of a planner is to work within the constraints of what you're given and make the best possible thing you can." Now that's all well and good, of course, that's all well and good, and I'm not disagreeing with that specifically. However, as to the question, are games art, or are you an artist, or whatever, I would say the answer to that is yes. And I know it sounds a bit arrogant to disagree with somebody about themselves, but here's what I mean by this, because I feel like everything is art in one way or another, and everybody is an artist in one way or another. And here's what I mean by that. If we look at, let's say, a toaster, for example. Let's take a toaster. Most of us think of a toaster as just a toaster. It is a toaster to toast your bread. That's all it does. Nothing more, nothing less. It is a toaster. When you go out to buy a toaster, your only concern is that it works, and, well, maybe not the only concern, you want it to work and not toast too much or whatever, but you generally just have a few concerns about what you need it to do, and as long as it does that, you're good, right? But if you consider the fact that not all toasters look the same, not all toasters are the same color, not all toasters have the same switch and button layout, not all toasters toast the same way. Some do a little bit lighter, some do a little bit darker, and so on. Some toasters pop the bread way out, some toasters don't even pop the bread out at all. All toasters are different. Toasters' lives matter. Yeah, my bad. And but yeah, they are different. So most of us, yeah, we look at toasters as just a toaster. But to an individual, the color of a toaster, the shape of a toaster, the size, everything else, that could mean something. That could create an emotion that reminds them of a time during their childhood when I don't know, things were nice and things were good, and it was just a simple life back then. It can mean something to somebody, and then maybe it doesn't mean anything to you, maybe it doesn't mean anything to most people in the world, but to somebody that means something. And that could be something that isn't necessarily, in fact, most likely not intended by the designer of the toaster. They just wanted to make something that they thought, okay, well, we want to make a toaster. Let's think about ergonomics. Let's think about toast density. I don't know, that's probably not even a thing, but they're thinking about, you know, how you can make it as practical as possible, and that's the thought process that's going into it. But in doing that, they managed to create something that to the individual meant something, and perhaps to that person they decided, you know what, I'm going to collect toasters because they mean something to me, even though that's not what was intended. They mean something to me, and that sounds a bit silly. But then consider this now as maybe a better example: cars. A lot of us look at cars and just say, well, a car is a car. It needs us. We need a car to get us from A to B. It is a tool used to transport yourself and maybe other people along with some items, possibly. Use it to drive to work, use it maybe to drop your kids off at school. It is a car. It is something that you use with a practical purpose. But how many people collect cars? How many people look at cars and see the design beauty in there, to see the, you know, to look at listen to the engine sounds, they look at the tires, and they like to sit inside a car and just feel the leather seats or whatever material the seats are made of. They just like to hear the engine roar because that means something to them. A lot of people do this. So even though that may not necessarily be what was intended by the designer, they're thinking, well, we're just going to make a car. When they're thinking, especially if you're looking at maybe, say, higher end cars, like, you know, fancy sports cars and that kind of stuff, they might be thinking more like, okay, people like this shape better, people like this engine noise, and people like this and that, and they want this engine size and capacity and CCs and whatever, and fuel gauge, pistons, whatever. You know, they're thinking of what people like, not necessarily what creates an emotional connection to the car. And, you know, I really wanted to create something that gave my stance on the war in Iraq. You know, they're probably not thinking that right. But to the individual who buys it, is like, that means something more than what was intended. So though it may not necessarily be intended to be art, it still can be art to the individual. But here's what I mean also when I said about everybody is an artist in some way, because here's a definition of art from Google. I think this is, I mean, people could define it in different ways, I know, but this is pretty much how I describe it: the expression or application of human creative skill and imagination, typically in a visual form such as painting or sculpture, producing works to be appreciated primarily for their beauty or emotional power. Now, typically, not necessarily only, but typically, so it can be music, it can be created for other reasons as well. But the main thing it's talking about here is the creative skill and imagination. And even in design, there is still creativity. Now, Shigeru Miyamoto, he was talking about you given a constraint and you work within that. That happens all the time in most forms of art. Even when you are just doing something for yourself, there's still some kind of constraints in the sense that you can only think so much. So there's always going to be a limit to your imagination in terms of you have a life that you've lived. Your imagination is limited to those experiences and what you know of that life. In other cases, say in more design cases, it's more like somebody else is saying, okay, we want this, this, and this, and you work within that. But the point I'm making is that it is always going to be some constraint somewhere. The constraint may not be obvious, and it may not always be apparent, and the constraint may be so vast that it's practically non-existent, but ultimately there's always a constraint. So you're always working within some kind of limit to something and doing the best you can within that. Furthermore, the creative aspects in the sense that, okay, you're given, say, set parameters to work within, but you're also looking at what can you do within that, and there's a thoughts behind that, and there's a creative behind that, because you also have to consider that you can't just make the exact same game that you've just made. Well, even though they kind of do that with every Mario and Zelda game they do, is pretty much they're all the same plot, but there are differences at least from one game to another, and that's the creativity. That's something that you haven't done before. That's something that they're thinking, okay, let's create something different. And maybe they're not doing it to create an emotional response specifically, but as a consumer, you can still get an emotional response from that. And it's not just about, how the game looks. I know people like to talk, when people talk about games of art, like Abzu and Thomas was here, and Was it Journey? Some of the games I mentioned in the No video as well. Those are typically ones that get mentioned. But even just games like Grand Theft Auto, it's going to mean something to somebody that's possibly beyond what the people intended. Art is subjective, and what you intend from something and what a person gets from it aren't always going to be the same thing. In fact, they very rarely are, because we are individuals and because we do experience things differently, and because different things do mean different things to different people. So even though, yes, Miyamoto can seem he's very well within his rights, of course, to see himself as a designer, I believe he's still an artist. I believe that anybody who does anything, whether creative, and not just creative in the sense of games and music and movies and books and the typical things we associate as creativity, but creative in just going through life and thinking for yourself and doing things different. There's a creative process behind that. So that's what I mean by that we are all artists, and everything is art in some way, shape or form. And even though it may not necessarily be intended to be art, intended to be this emotional connection journey and take on political and social and religious views and so on, it may not be intended for that, but it can still be that for a person. And yeah, anyway, that is what I think of Shigeru Miyamoto's comments about art and video games. Villagers, what do you think? But is it art or you said but? Let me know down below, and if you liked this video, give it a like and share it amongst your friends. If you did not like it, then give it a dislike and share it amongst your enemies. Either way, let me know your reasons in the comments. Subscribe if you have not already. Thank you for watching, and until whenever, if ever, we are the music makers, and we are the dreamers of dreams.